change. And I think it's important also to not lose sight of a broader perspective that human development approach does provide. Because sometimes I fear that we may be too focused on solving specific problems without attending to unintended consequences. So an example is electrification for the energy transition. This is something very important, should be pursued. But we need to ask ourselves, where are the critical minerals that are needed for the batteries and solar panels going to come from? And the reality is that sometimes they are being extracted in places in which there are violations of human rights and biodiversity loss. So by focusing on a single problem without having this broader perspective of the interlinkages which human development provides, not the only way, but it's one way, I think that it's going to be very relevant as we go forward. Secondly, I think that we are seeing evidence in many parts of the world in which many people are, in a sense, losing the narratives of their lives, losing a sense of control about their future. In the United States, for instance, Anne Case and Angus Deaton have written about deaths of despair. You know, this is a rich country. Is it something, it's a problem only of rich countries? Well, in our latest Human Development Report, we found evidence that 6 out of every 7 people around the world feel insecure about some aspects of their lives. So there is a sense of insecurity that is increasing in many countries. We also found that perceptions of insecurity are associated with decline in trust, and therefore trust today is at the lowest level on record. Less than 1 in 3 people claim to trust one another. And also we see that people that feel insecure tend to be attracted to the extremes of the political spectrum, so they become more polarized. So this means that this is a context in which addressing shared challenges, both within countries and across countries, is in some sense becoming more difficult. So I'll just conclude by saying that the pursuit of human development is an invitation to help us to address this, at least these two challenges going forward, because it puts an emphasis on this notion of agency. And I use here a phrase from Amartya Sen where he says that we should look at people not as patients, but as agents, as people able to change their destiny if they are given the conditions to do so. So I see the pursuit of human development as a continuation of this journey, this open-ended journey. Congratulations on the 25 years of the Institute for Human Development. Looking forward to the conclave, which I think is going to be an important stepping stone towards the continuation of this journey into the next 25 years, as Deepak Nayar said, and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedro. Now I invite Dr. Norbert Shaddy, Chief Economist, Human Development, the World Bank, Washington, D.C., to please address the gathering.
So thank you very much. I had prepared some notes here on growth and human development and the interlinkages between economic growth and human development. But I'm actually going to save these. I'm giving another address in about half an hour, 45 minutes, and I don't want to bore you too much by repeating not what others have said, but even worse, what I say myself. It's hard enough to listen to somebody once, leave alone listen to them twice. But I do think it's very important to think about, and as I'll make the point in a bit, I do think it's very important to think about both the inherent and the instrumental value of human development. Inherent, obviously, many of the things that we're talking about are things that we think are important in and of themselves, but there's a very tight linkage between human development, human capital, as some would call it, and economic performance, and it's not something we should forget about. But let me actually spend the next 3 or 4 minutes reflecting upon something that I think most of us would rather forget, which is the impact of the pandemic on human development and the extent to which this is or is not something that is in the past. And I say many of us would rather forget it. I'm often in government discussions where we talk about this, and people, like most of us individually, we want to think about things are getting better and things are in the past and we don't have to worry about them anymore. And I just want to make the point that the shock that the pandemic was for human development was profound, and the evidence that we have up until this point is that it is a shock that is still with us now. Now, the pandemic itself may be, if you want, maybe not over, but certainly the acute phase of the pandemic appears to be over. But the shock that it did in terms, or the shock that it had in terms of what it did to human development is not over. And I just want to give you a couple of factoids, because I think it illustrates well how there's interplay between human development and various other things. So what we have, obviously, in the pandemic is first a tremendous health shock, which led to a severe economic contraction, which at the same time then led to a profound shock, a profound decline in human development and human capital. And I just want to give you a few factoids, and I'll return to some of those when I talk in a little bit. So in addition to the maybe 20 million or so excess deaths, which we all have heard about, and the contraction in GDP that we all also know so much about, let me tell you a little bit about some of the things that happened to human development per se, or human capital, if you want. So we know for young children, children under the age of 5, we've thought a lot about the extent to which there was a contraction or a worsening of nutritional status, and the evidence is actually kind of mixed on this. But what there is very clear evidence is of a profound, deep shock to other measures of early childhood development. So what we have is, for example, we have data, since I'm in South Asia, I'll talk about these data for Bangladesh, but we have data from other countries as well, where we show that on average, children who were exposed to the pandemic progressed about a year less than those who were not exposed to the pandemic in terms of their cognitive, language, and other dimensions of development. So you can think of a child who is 3 years of age, say. If there had been no pandemic, this child might not have had the development of a 3-year-old, because we live in poor countries, and therefore the levels of development of this child would have been below par, if you want, already. This child is now a year behind where she would have been if the pandemic had not occurred. Not only that, there's an extensive literature with a number of contributions by Nobel Prize winners and others, and something that I've done a lot of research on myself, which shows that unless we can reverse this, these children are going to carry, if you want, the shadow of what happened to them in early childhood for the rest of their lives. They will have fewer years of schooling. They will have difficulties in the labor market. They are likely to have higher incidence of criminal behavior. They're likely to be more productive in various ways. These are things, like I said, that we all wish were not so. But that is how they are. And so I think there's a lot that we need to think about as a development community, if you want, about what is it about the pandemic that still lingers, and what can we do to reverse some of these setbacks that have occurred. I've talked about young children, so let me talk now about school-aged children. And I should say much of this is, the World Bank puts out a publication every 2 years or so in the vice presidency that I'm the chief economist for human development, and the publication that we put out at the beginning of 2023 was precisely on the effects of the pandemic, and much of this can be found in this publication, and I'm happy if people just type in my name into the web, they'll be able to get the publication quite quickly, and it sort of shows a lot of what I'm talking about now. So let's talk about school-aged children now for a second. So school-aged children, what we know is that throughout the developing world, there were unprecedentedly long school closures. And in fact, we know that school closures were longer in South Asia and Latin America than anywhere else in the world. Schools closed in many countries for 2 full years. In other countries for a year, year and a half. So let me tell you what happened when schools closed. What happened when schools closed is, and this is not a rhetorical statement, this is what the evidence showed. While schools closed, children learned nothing. Nothing. There was zero learning while schools closed, on average. So that means if you're in country X and your school's closed for 2 years, your children on average are now 2 years behind where they should be for their age. And not only did they learn nothing on average while schools were closed, there's actually quite a bit of variability, quite a bit of heterogeneity, if you want, in what happened to children's learning during the pandemic. And what I mean by that is that we actually know that children of higher socioeconomic status did learn something while schools were closed. Now you might think, this gentleman here, he's saying something that is a little bit strange. He's saying that on average, children learn nothing, but richer children did learn something. So how does all of this square? There must be some fundamental problem of arithmetic that he hasn't thought about. Well, the answer to that is that poorer children in developing countries actually unlearned what they already knew. So what does this mean, unlearned? What it means, and you can think of a child who is maybe at the beginning of, or at the end of second grade when schools closed. This child, maybe, if she was lucky, already knew how to do addition and subtraction. And in the next year, she was supposed to learn how to do multiplication and division. Schools closed for a year in this hypothetical country, which is not so hypothetical. In fact, it's actually, for many developing countries, this is a positive scenario that schools only closed for a year. So for this child who was supposed to now learn how to multiply and divide, not only did she not learn how to multiply and divide, she actually forgot how to add and subtract. So this child who had 1 year of school closure is now 2 years behind in her development, in her ability to, in her learning, in her ability to do things, to carry out things that she was supposed to be able to do. Then let's talk finally about what happened also for young people who were meant to join the labor market, maybe people who are 18, 19, depending on the country. In some countries, maybe people who were supposed to go to university or had gone to university and then were meant to enter the labor market. What happened? We know there was a profound, deep shock, obviously, to labor markets and to the ability of these people to join the labor market. And we also know from a lot of literature that there are profound, long-lasting scarring effects when people cannot enter the labor market, when they are supposed to have difficulties entering the labor market, to the extent that we can actually trace when there's an economic shock. Economic shock's a lot less deep than the pandemic, shall I say. We can actually find the effects of this 10, 15 years later in the labor market outcomes of these young people. So what do I conclude from all of this? I conclude a few things. One is that we obviously care about human development inherently, but human development is very tightly linked with other things that are happening in the economy and in our societies in general. Let me go back to what I said. This was originally a health shock that led to an economic shock, and an economic shock which essentially led to a human capital, human development collapse in many developing countries, especially those where the pandemic hit hardest, and especially those where policymakers sort of grappling with the challenge of what to do during the pandemic chose in particular to close schools for the longest. And so what we are now faced with is not simply a scenario in which we have the, if you want, long-standing difficulties, the long-standing challenges in human development, but we are in many ways, and again, we have a lot of details of this in the publication, in many dimensions of human development, we are now 20 years behind where we would have been had there not been a pandemic. We have data, for example, Brazil, a substantially richer country than many of the countries in the global south, in which the learning outcomes for kids now are roughly 20 years behind where they would have been or where they were right before the pandemic. They've lost 2 decades in terms of improvement in learning outcomes, and much the same can be said for other countries and for other dimensions in human development. So I guess I want to leave you with 2 messages. One is, when we think about human development, and this is something obviously that we all know, we need to think about human development in the context of all of these other things that are happening at the same time. It's no good just thinking about our little piece of it, but rather we have to think about all of this together. And second, that sadly and unfortunately, we are in a much worse place than we were 3, 4, 5 years ago in many of these dimensions in many of the countries that we're most concerned about. So I leave you with that not particularly uplifting thought, but I think it is important to think about this because I think it'll motivate us to figure out what are the kinds of policies and the kinds of programs that we can best enact to actually recover human capital as much as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shadi. And these insightful and very profound addresses have pretty much set the tone and tempo of the deliberations that will happen in the course of the 3 days of this conference. I now invite Dr. Tanuka Endo, Professor, Institute for Human Development and the Coordinator of Center for Gender Studies, to propose the vote of thanks of this session.
Thank you, Priyanka, and good morning, everyone. We indeed have picked up quite a lot of food for thought, I think, in this inaugural session, and I hope it will, go on in the next 3 days. It is my pleasant duty to present the vote of thanks, and I begin by thanking all participants in the inaugural session, Professor Deepak Nair, Dr. Pedro, Dr. Norbert, Dr. Yogesh Suri, Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, and Professor Alakhan Sharma. I would also like to reiterate that we are extremely grateful to our co-organizers, Niti Aayog and RIS, especially thanks to the RIS team for administrative and logistics support for our overseas participants. Thanks a lot. And I would also like to reiterate that we are extremely grateful to our partners, ISSR, ILO, the World Bank, UNDP, UN, Woods University, and UNICEF. So thank you all, and thank you participants for coming here, as Sir said in the early winter morning. Hope you enjoyed the film, and we hope that you all enjoy a very stimulating and engaging 3-day conclave. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Tanuka ji. That was short and crisp. Yes, a lot of thanks are due to a lot of other people. There are lots of partners, as ma'am mentioned, and there are several collaborators who are organizing several events throughout the conference. They also deserve a big thanks. Like today, the Gokhale Institute will be hosting a lunch, and there'll be several from, they're all there on the backside of the program book, which will be available on this wall throughout the day. So thanks to all the partners and all the collaborators. Now we take a break. We would request you, since we have extended our first session, to take a quick break for 15 minutes, as Sir says, and then please come back to the hall because we'll start with the first plenary session on panel on growth and human development linkages. Thank you. We'll reassemble in the hall as quick as possible. Would request you to kindly come back in the hall after 15 minutes. Thank you. Sir, a group photograph.
Here for another week, so
we can have
follow-up conversations. Yeah. My well, you come here. Make sure we do have the gender balance. Not very balanced, I have to say, but okay.